VR games have come an incredibly long way since their inception, with countless technological advances. Maybe it's not been the smoothest of journeys, but it has been exciting. Today, we're going to chart that journey, starting at the beginning. One of the first examples of gaming pushing in the direction of the virtual reality we know today came from Sega, with their 3D glasses paired with the Master System. Here we see Space Harrier 3D. This was released in 1987, and whilst not yet the immersive experience we know from modern virtual reality, Sega have been able to successfully reproduce their game in full 3D. This was just the beginning. In the early 90s, a company called Virtuality stepped into the field with their range of stereoscopic arcade machines. Here we see Dactyl Nightmare on the Virtuality 1000 CS, which, although released way back in 1991, is already well ahead of its time with these 3D polygon graphics. This simple style did an awesome job of showcasing the possibilities of first-person shooters in VR. Which takes us through to 1995, when Nintendo would announce the now infamous Nintendo Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was an attempt at a full virtual reality headset. It launched with a small number of games that included Mario Tennis, in which you're given a courtside view as Mario and his friends compete in a tennis tournament. They also released Red Alert, a very low-fidelity space shooter. The Nintendo Virtual Boy would go on to be one of Nintendo's most famous failures, with consumers being let down by the lack of colour and the low-fidelity graphics. This would put a halt to virtual reality gaming for many years. To be precise, for 17 years, right up to 2012, when a 19-year-old man called Palmer Luckey unveils a device he calls the Oculus Rift, the first example of a true modern virtual reality headset. Luckey teamed up with legendary game developer John Carmack, and the first game that they showcased running in VR was Carmack's own Doom 3. Here we can see the massive jump we've made since the early days. For the first time, it truly feels like you're being placed inside the game from a first-person perspective. We have 3 degrees of movement head tracking, so if you turn your head, so does the character on the screen. The game is running on a gaming PC and it's played with an Xbox controller. It's an incredibly immersive experience and it marks a turning point for the industry. The Oculus Rift development kit would soon launch, and it would see support from some really exciting games. Some highlights would include Valve's chaotic multiplayer shooter Team Fortress 2, and a couple of games that would showcase the power of simulation through virtual reality in Euro Truck Simulator 2, in which we travel across Europe as a trucker delivering important cargo, and one of my all-time favourites, Assetto Corsa, a game that would set the standard for virtual reality driving simulation to this very day. Pairing a wheel and pedals with the Oculus Rift really took things to the next level. Before Oculus could release a consumer version of their VR headset, they had a partnership brewing with Samsung. They would release the Samsung Gear VR, a mobile phone powered VR headset. You would slide your mobile phone into the front of a plastic enclosure with some lenses. This would provide the ability to generate VR content from your mobile phone screen and run games natively on your phone. Now, despite a few genuinely interesting games, the overall experience just wasn't as polished as you would get on a true VR headset, and they would soon see competition from other companies such as Google, which would feature even less optimization, and the overall experience for the general consumer was fairly off-putting, with many people having their experience of VR tainted by the idea of mobile VR and would take many years to be convinced to jump back in. Which takes us up to March 2016, when the Oculus Rift consumer version would launch. This is the first modern virtual reality headset for the everyday man, bringing with it 6 degrees of freedom tracking, so not only could you tilt your head, but you could move anywhere in a room and the VR headset would track your position. Now we were really being placed in the game. And along with it came some very exciting games. Valkrie put us in the cockpit for a first-person space shooter on an immense scale. And games like Keep Talking and Nobody Explode showed us just how much fun we could have with friends in virtual reality. But 2016 was the year that we took a very important step. Our hands came into virtual reality with the release of the Vive Wands, the Oculus Touch controllers, and the PlayStation VR with the PlayStation Move controllers. Competition was getting fierce and there were some very exciting games to accompany accompany it. Now, it's worth noting that whilst this footage does look pretty sharp on a YouTube video, the screens in an Oculus Rift were much lower resolution than the kind of VR headsets we see today. So when you're wearing your headset, everything looked a little bit blurry. We dealt with things called the screen door effect, where it looked like you're looking through a grid. There was chromatic aberration, where all the colours kind of blurred out and you saw this kind of purple fringing around images. And we had to deal with God rays. That's a kind of artifact driven by Fresnel lenses, where the light that is used to illuminate an image kind of flares out in a kind of mock halo effect around an image. Now, the PSVR and the HTC Vive were very strong competition for Oculus. PSVR released alongside some very impressive exclusive games. A highlight for me being Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, a genuinely terrifying game that holds up to this very day. And all platforms were taking full advantage of the new VR controllers that made the whole experience so much less passive. A good example of this is the climb that really captured people's imaginations, as it made it feel like you were really out climbing mountains. The controllers made it so simple to replicate real life movements. As we move into 2017, more depth comes to VR games. The release of Lone Echo demonstrated just how immersive a story could be when paired with virtual reality, and it showcased the possibility of moving away from classic tropes like combat and relying on things like an engaging dialogue and some really clever puzzles. It would take a high-powered gaming PC to really maximise these opportunities, but things were getting impressive. Towards the end of 2017, two of the most epic adventures from the entire world of gaming came to virtual reality, with the release of Skyrim VR letting you loose in a massive open world full of opportunity, and Fallout 4 came to VR, which gave a whole new perspective to the dystopian worlds of Fallout. These enormous RPGs brought the opportunity to lose days and days into your favourite game when wearing a VR headset. As we entered 2018, one of VR's first runaway successes would release. Beat Saber, a rhythm-based lightsaber game, would go on to break records, selling over 10 million songs in downloadable content alone, and to this day holding the record for the highest selling VR game of all time. But 2018 would actually prove to be the year that VR started to turn in a new direction. In May, Oculus released the Oculus Go, a stand-alone VR headset that didn't need to be tethered to a PC or gaming console. Now, the Oculus Go itself wasn't a particularly exciting piece of kit. It was very limited in its scope. It had one controller, it had 3 degrees of freedom, not the full 6 that we now came to expect from most games, but it did allow for a very affordable entry point, and suddenly developers were able to sell to much more people. In December of 2018, another of VR's most popular games would launch. Blade and Sourcery launched on the PC and brought with it a new focus on virtual reality physics, in particular melee combat. This would go on to spawn an entire new genre and bring with it a sense of mayhem that just hadn't been seen before in the VR world. The year of 2019 would bring many advancements. We'd see the release of the Oculus Rift S, a PC VR focused headset that brought with it a much higher resolution. We also saw Valve enter the fray with the release of the Valve Index, a very competitive VR headset with a wide field of view, enabling you to see much more of the virtual world around you. But Oculus weren't finished yet, and we would also see the release of the Oculus Quest. This was another stand-alone VR headset, but it was much more advanced than what we'd seen with the Oculus Go. The Quest appeared to bridge the gap between high-fidelity PC VR gaming and low-fidelity mobile VR gaming. This appeared to send developers in two directions. We'd see releases on PC VR that would really push fidelity with some really exciting immersive graphics, and then we'd see less visually impressive games on the Quest, but which you were able to play with a much greater sense of freedom, not being tethered to a machine. You could move freely in your own environment. The difference between the two platforms becomes quite stark when you examine some of the biggest releases from 2019. Some standouts for me were Asgard's Wrath, a 40-hour RPG that released for the Oculus Rift with some genuinely impressive visuals. We also saw the release of Boneworks, one of the most innovative VR games that have ever been created, and really pushed forwards the expectation on VR physics. Your entire environment could be interacted with and everything would react in the way it physically should in the real world. Whilst on the Quest platform we saw more simplistic games release. Some examples include Shooty Fruity, a multitasking first-person shooter that really focused on mayhem and ensuring you have fun. Or Space Pirate Trainer, a wave shooter set in space that would pit you against relentless waves of droids. Things proved to get challenging as developers wanted their games to be available to as many people as possible, so often PC VR games would be optimised so they could also be played on the Quest. In some circumstances, this led to downgrades and the visuals that you would expect on the PC, much to the dismay of the people that have been playing those games up to now. So that takes us up to 2020, which is in my opinion the greatest year of VR games releases ever, led in no small part by the release of Half-Life Alyx. Half-Life Alyx is in my opinion VR's crowning moment. Valve cleverly weaved together every advancement that we've discussed so far in this video to create a masterpiece. A game with a fantastic story that looks incredible in an environment that you can interact with perfectly, well balanced with far less of the jankiness that you've seen in earlier titles, really demonstrating what can be accomplished when big developers get behind VR games. We also saw the release of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, a first-person survival horror game that absolutely blew away all expectations, quickly becoming an overnight favourite. Another game that did a great job of balancing a fantastic story with some well-designed VR mechanics. As we reached October, we saw the release of Star Wars Squadrons. Developed by EA, this was an incredibly polished space shooter, a game that played fantastically whether you're playing on a flat screen or in VR. It really felt like we were on a roll. Multiple times this year, we'd had games released that had blown away previous efforts. But 2020 wasn't finished with us yet. Oculus had prepared a surprise release of the Oculus Quest 2. Little did we know at the time, but this would drastically change the trajectory of VR game development. The Quest 2 boasted incredibly impressive specs for the price point. They'd stepped up the resolution, they'd stepped up the processing power, it was able to run standalone or be connected to a PC if you had one. This brought with it the most compelling reason so far for people without a gaming PC to step into VR for the first time. And boy did people take them up on that offer, the headset sold incredibly well. Alongside the release of the Quest 2, we saw the release of Population 1. Population 1 was VR's first successful battle royale. You might think, well, this game looks slightly less visually impressive than some of the titles we saw earlier in the list. Well, Population 1 looked identical whether you ran it on a high-end PC VR headset or natively on your Quest. We really were finding that the demand was so much higher for Quest games because so many more people were buying into it because it was so easy without a PC that we were seeing more and more games developed with the Quest specifically in mind. The final notable release from 2020 is another game from EA. Medal of Honor Above and Beyond sought to revive an old and much loved IP and bring it to a new life in VR. I really enjoyed Above and Beyond. It was a smooth and slick first-person shooter, but it doesn't conjure fond memories because it marked the last time we would see a major developer release a high-quality PC VR title for some time. The reason for that? It just didn't get the sales. Games developed for the Quest platform that had taken much less time and much less money were outselling it tenfold, leaving the multiplayer lobbies of Above and Beyond barren. You could search for hours and not find a teammate to play with. The next time we would see a game really testing the limits of what VR was capable of wouldn't be for another 7 months. In July of 2021, VR capability was added to Microsoft Flight Simulator. Incredibly challenging to run on even the most capable of gaming PCs, this game looks absolutely fantastic, some of the best visuals that have ever been rendered on a VR headset. The game used Bing's aerial and satellite imagery to render a very realistic replication of the Earth. The sense of freedom and exploration given by this game is unparalleled. But whilst this pushed on, the standalone community was growing. We were seeing more and more successful launches of Quest games. A growing trend was the Quest port, where a successful retro game was ported to run on the Quest. A key example of this is Resident Evil 4 that launched in October of 21 and became the fastest selling Quest game to date. As we moved into 2022, all of the major releases were on the Quest platform. We were really seeing the hardware being pushed to its limits. Some key examples were Zenith The Lost City, the first successful massively multiplayer online role-playing game for the Quest. Although this game might not be graphically striking, it was impressive that a game of this sheer scale could run on the Quest. But that was just the beginning. As we reached September of 2022, Ramen VR released Bone Labs. To unprecedented success, the game hit the £1 million sales mark in the first hour of sales. Bone Labs was a sequel to the previously discussed Boneworks, and Ramen VR had managed to reproduce the incredibly impressive graphics and physics of Boneworks, but without the need for a high-powered gaming PC. We were once again beginning to see games at the bleeding edge. Which kind of brings us to where we are now, and it isn't entirely clear in which direction VR games will develop next. We've just had the release of the Meta Quest Pro, and around the corner we've got the release of the PSVR 2. Will standalone VR games or console-powered VR games be the driving force for the next few years of game development? Meta might lead you to believe that mixed reality games will be the next big innovation. We've seen some interesting games in development using the Quest Pro's hardware. Some examples would be Demio, which has just released an update that lets you play the game in your home environment. A pretty slick example of how the tech can be used. Or Spacial Ops, a first-person shooter that again lets you take the game to your own environment. Both are interesting, but I'm not sure if it will be the truly engaging experience we're looking for. The PSVR 2 promises some exclusive experiences that could be very compelling. They bring some big IPs to the table, with some exciting games like Horizon Call of the Mountain, that could potentially be the AAA experiences that we've been waiting for. Will one platform lead the way, or will it be a combination of the two? At this point, I'm not entirely sure, but I think either way, we win. And I'm in it for the long run and can't wait to see some really exciting stuff. So at this point, I'm putting it back on you. What's been your most exciting gaming experience in VR so far, and what do you hope to see in the coming years? Let me know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video and if you found it insightful, then do us a favour, press that like button, and I would love to see you at the next video. Thank you very much. Goodbye.